You know, people always talk about the American dream like it's some white picket fence and a manicured lawn. But for a guy like me, living out here in the high desert of Arizona, the dream is just being left the hell alone. My name's Elias Thorne, and I've spent 60 years watching the sun bake this dust on the Black Ridge Ranch, a place my grandfather bought with poker winnings and sweat back when the only neighbors we had were the coyotes and the wind. For decades, it was just us, the cattle, and the silence, but then the progress, started creeping in from the east, bringing with it a suburban cancer called the Pine Crest Estates. Suddenly, I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I was an eyesore, or zoning noncompliance issue, to a bunch of folks who moved to the desert and then complained that it looked too much like the desert. It started with letters, the kind of passive-aggressive stationery that smells like expensive perfume and entitlement, telling me my fence wasn't in oppos, the right shade of weathered wood, or that my cows were audibly disruptive, during brunch hours. I ignored them, naturally, because my family has held the deed to this canyon since before their developers were even born, but things turned dark when they realized I wasn't in oppos, going to roll over for their grand vision of a gated paradise. They wanted my north pasture for a golf course extension, and when I told them to pound sand, they didn't in oppos. Take it as a final answer. They took it as a challenge. I remember the morning it all broke wide open. The air was crisp, smelling of sagebrush and the coming rain, and I was out on the porch drinking coffee with my wife, Sarah. She's the heart of this place, the kind of woman who can bottle peaches all morning and fix a broken tractor by noon. But I saw the way her hands were shaking as she held her mug. We'd been followed in town. We'd had trucks idling at our gate at 3 in the morning, and the latest tucked into our gate wasn't in oppos. From a lawyer, it was a hand-scrawled note saying, accidents happen to old houses. Elias, think of your grandkids. That's the moment the air changed. The moment I stopped looking at them as annoying neighbors and started seeing them as a threat to my bloodline. I was cleaning my old Coal .45 on the porch, just routine maintenance really, when I heard the crunch of gravel that didn't and oppos. Belonged to any vehicle I owned. 2 men were standing there at the main gate, which I keep locked with a heavy-duty chain, and they wearing and oppos. Wearing suits this time. They had on these tactical-looking black vests with, HOA enforcement, slapped across the chest in bright yellow letters, a title they clearly printed themselves because, let's be honest, an HOA has as much legal police power as a middle school hall monitor. But they wearing and oppos. Laughing, and neither was I. The tall one, a guy with a military haircut and a sneer that looked like it had been carved into his face, started banging on the gate with a steel baton, shouting about, property inspection, mandatory deed verification, He kept saying the board had authorized an immediate seizure of the northern perimeter for, public safety reasons, which is just a fancy way of saying they wanted to steal my land without paying for it. His partner, a shorter, thick-set man with a goatee and eyes that moved too fast, was leaning against the fence post, casually flipping a folding knife open and shut, click, swish, like he was practicing for a role in a bad movie. I stepped off the porch, feeling the weight of the Colt in my holster, and I walked down that long dirt path toward the gate, every step feeling like I was walking deeper into a storm I couldn't in oppos. Outrun. You're trespassing on private, deeded ranch land, I said, my voice coming out low and gravelly, not because I was trying to be tough, but because my throat was tight with the kind of cold fury I hadn't in oppos. Felt in years. I told them they had 10 seconds to get back in their shiny black SUV and disappear before I called the sheriff. But the tall one just laughed, a dry, hollow sound that didn't into oppos. Reached his eyes. The sheriff is a friend of the board, Elias, he said, leaning over the gate, so close I could smell the peppermint on his breath, And we aren't in oppos. Leaving until we get a signature on these surrender documents. See, we know Sarah's home alone a lot while you're out checking the lines, and it'd be a real shame if she tripped on one of these old floorboards and nobody was there to hear her scream. The world went silent then, the kind of silence that happens right before a lightning strike, and I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of the realization that these men had crossed the one line you never cross with a man like me. The guy with the knife took a step toward the gap in the fence, the blade glinting in the Arizona sun, and he looked past me toward the house where Sarah was watching through the screen door. He made a suggestive comment, something vile about what he'd do once they, civilized, this ranch, and he started to climb over the gate like it was a playground fence. I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T warned him again, because a man who threatens your wife and home ISN and oppose. T looking for a conversation, he's looking for a lesson. I drew the Colt in one fluid motion, the muscle memory from 40 years of practice taking over, and I leveled it right at the chest of the man with the knife. He froze, one leg over the gate, the smug grin on his face curdling into a mask of pure shock as he realized that the old man wasn't oppose. T bluffing. Get back over that gate, I whispered, and for a second, I thought he'd do it, but his partner, the tall one, reached behind his back for something, shouting that I wooed and oppose. T had the guts to pull the trigger on, official business, The first shot was a roar that seemed to tear the sky open, the recoil snapping up through my arm like a familiar handshake. I hit the knife wielder in the thigh, a calculated move to stop his momentum without ending his life right then and there, and he went down like a sack of wet grain, his knife clattering onto the rocks. The tall one finally cleared whatever he was reaching for. It was a heavy-duty taser, but in the world of ballistics, he'd brought a sparkler to a cannon fight. I shifted my aim and put a round through the gate post inches from his head, the wood splinters spraying his face, and that was all it took for his official bravado to evaporate into thin air. He fell backward, scrambling in the dirt, his expensive tactical vest covered in the dust he'd spent so much time looking down on. I stood there, the smoke curling from the barrel of my gun, watching them realize that their little HOA power trip had just collided with the reality of the Old West. I didn't oppose. T move. I didn't oppose. T even blink. I just kept the sights on the tall one's chest while Sarah called the real authorities, not the ones who play dress-up on weekends. When the state troopers arrived, it was a mess of sirens and shouting, but I stayed right on my porch, hands empty and visible, the Colt sitting on the table next to my cold coffee. They cuffed the enforcement officers first, and, as it turned out, the tall guy wasn't oppose, a veteran or a cop. He was a disgraced security guard with a history of assault charges who'd been hired under the table by the HOA president, a man named Marcus Vane who thought he was the king of Black Ridge. The investigation took months, and they tried to come for my permit. They tried to say I used excessive force. But the beauty of living on a ranch is that you have plenty of room for security cameras, and those cameras caught every word of the threats they made against Sarah. The local community was split down the middle, half of them calling me a hero for standing up to the Pinecrest tyrants, and the other half claiming I was a dangerous relic who should be locked away for, escalating a property dispute. But here's the thing, it was never about a fence or a deed or a golf course. It was about the fact that some people think that because they have a title and a budget, they own the souls of the people around them. They thought they could bully a rancher because I'm old and my clothes are stained with oil and dirt, but they forgot that this dirt belongs to me because my family bled for it. Marcus Vane ended up resigning in disgrace. The HOA was sued into oblivion by the shareholders for the legal liability he'd created, and the Pinecrest estates, are a lot quieter these days. I still sit on my porch every morning, the Colt is back and it's safe, and the gate has a new, even heavier chain on it. Sometimes I see the residents of the estates driving by, slowing down to stare at the old man on the porch, and I just tip my hat. They look at me like I'm a ghost from a different era, and maybe I am, but I'm a ghost that still bites if you try to haunt my house. So, I've got to ask you, if you were standing there with your family behind you and a man with a knife telling you what he's going to do to your wife, would you wait for a lawyer to tell you it's okay to protect them? Or would you do what needs to be done to make sure your bloodline stays on its land? Some people call it violence. I call it housekeeping. Let me know in the comments if you think I went too far, or if you'd have pulled that trigger too, because out here, the law is only as good as the man willing to uphold it. Would you have let them over that gate, or would you have stood your ground like I did? I'm real curious to see where you all draw the line.